Swaminathan ji. So Ganesh Swaminathan ji is having his studies in mechanical engineering, graduation from IIT Delhi long back, and he also has his MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, and he is working with some technology in since last nearly 20 years. If please correct me if I'm wrong. And he has a very nice interest in space science right from his schooling. And Ganeshi is reading these Puranas from over since last 8 years. More than that also you can say that, because he is having his interest in space science from his school days. And he has recently published a very wonderful book. I want him to introduce about his book. That will be better introduction of that book. So thank you very much, Ganesh Swaminathan ji, for joining us today. Let me introduce myself. My name is Siddharth Tiwari. I am right now in Bhubaneswar, city of Odisha state of India. And today I am hosting this webinar on behalf of iHeart Bharat. So we are with us, have some very prominent persons also from iHeart Group, Sri Suren Singh Besti, who is always leading us from behind. This is something very nice. And we have Vedvir Aji, who is a very renowned scholar of history. So I will now hand over this session to Ganesh Swaminathan ji. You are very much welcome. Please.
Thank you very much, Siddharth ji, for a wonderful introduction. Thanks to the iHeart team, steering committee, for giving me an opportunity to present my findings. Thanks to all of you for putting time aside on this auspicious day to listen to my presentation. And let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible now.
And finally, thanks to Siddharth for coming up with this wonderful artwork that I'm going to use as the cover of my presentation. So I'll just give you an agenda. I'll have a very short introduction about myself, the presentation about the sun and its life cycle. We'll talk about the life cycle of the sun, the first 3 stages, the birth, the youth, and mature stage, and we will go through it in some detail. And then we'll talk about the life cycle of the sun, the final 2 stages, and then there'll be a summary and a close. And then in which I'll have the summary of my findings, a few words about the book. And Subroto ji asked me to talk about my personal journey, so I have one slide on that as well. And after that, we can take some question and answers. Okay, so I think it should be, so my presentation should be about 60 minutes and about maybe 15 minutes of question and answers. Let's go to the introduction. Very quickly, Surendraji has already introduced me. I am a mechanical engineer from IIT Delhi. I received my MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, and I've been working with US technology multinationals for most of my profession. And I've had an interest in space science from school. I have no degree in astronomy or anything of that sort, just an interest in space science. I used to read books from school, like, I don't know, people remember from that time, Science Reporter magazines and so on. So I taught myself that. I've been reading the Puranas for a little over 8 years, and I've just published a book. The book that I published, it quotes about 15 different texts, including the Puranas. And today's talk will quote 3 Puranas. There'll be quotations from the Brahmanda Purana, the Markandeya Purana, and the Varaha Purana. Some few introductory remarks for the talk. So first thing is, this presentation quotes from the English translations of the book. These translations are by a board of scholars, and they are sponsored by the government of India, and they were accepted by UNESCO, and this was in the 1950s, so some time back. I have made no alterations to this translation, not even a comma or a parent brackets. If any comments in brackets are the comments of the translator. I have not made any changes at all to out of respect for the translation. The second thing is that I want to call out is that the word Purana in Sanskrit means ancient. It really means ancient. And so the Purana actually describes events from deep in the earth's past, in the long past of the earth. But it's very difficult to believe that an old text like this, which we think is about 2000 years old, can offer a complete cosmology of the universe, right? But my request is that please hold your thoughts and listen to the presentation and all the facts that I want to share, and then make up your mind. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And so in the presentation, both the science and the Puranas are quoted, and always the science is quoted first, because we want to know where modern science is today, right? So we will begin with the science of the sun, very brief introduction of the science of the sun. So the sun is one of the billions of low mass stars in the Milky Way. So our Milky Way has billions of stars, and there are billions of galaxies like our Milky Way. Over 90% of the sun is hydrogen, and most of the rest is helium. It is the host star for our solar system. So every system, planetary system, has to have a star, and the sun is our star. It is a source of all our energy, and the heat of the sun and the other factors, they drive the winds and rain and make life possible. The sun is very hard to study, but the scientists can make predictions by studying other similar stars. So if you look at a star, say, let's say 500, maybe 10,000 light years away or 5,000 light years away, then of a similar nature than the sun, then you know what a star looked like about 5,000 years ago. And by studying a whole range of such stars, you can get an idea of what the life cycle of the sun is, of a star like the sun is. And this is something that was done about 100 years ago. So a classification system was created called the HR classification system. And so it's very well founded. Although we can't study the sun directly, the data around this has a lot of scientific background to it. There are still a lot of questions about the sun that we don't know, but there is enough that we know that we can discuss today. So the sun is a very complex entity. For our discussion today, we can look at it as having two significant layers. There is a core, and the fusion occurs in the core. This is a region of very high temperature and pressure. So the temperature is in millions of degrees centigrade at very high pressure. And here hydrogen is converted using fusion to helium, right? So this is where all the energy is produced. And in the shell is where the energy is transferred outwards. So it's transferred outwards through convection and radiation. And there are, of course, further layers outside called the photosphere and the chromosphere and the corona, but they are not of interest to us today. So you can see in the image here, you have the core, you have the radiation zone, and then you have the convection zone. A few words about the sun from the Puranas. So we know practically everything in the solar system is from the sun, right? All the energy in the solar system, practically all the energy in the solar system originates from the sun. Therefore, any act of creation requires energy. And if sun is the only source of energy, the sun is the source of all the creation. So the Brahmanda Purana has the following verses. It says, the entire universe, including the Devas, Asuras, human beings, originate from the sun or leading Brahmanas. The sun alone is at the root of the three worlds. He is the highest deity. It is from him everything is born, and everything gets merged into him alone, right? And in all the quotations you will see, I have not only stated the Purana, I've stated where, in which chapter and which section and which verse it is in the Purana, in case you want to make a reference again. So it's very clearly documented. The second thing I wanted to call out is that I've underlined this part which says everything gets merged into him alone. And this is not something that we normally think about, but I want you to hold that thought, and we'll explain this as we go forward. So when you look at the life cycle of the sun, it has 5 stages, broadly, right? The 5 stages are birth, the young star, the mature stage, the red giant stage, and the white dwarf stage. And we'll talk about each of these in some details in front, but I just want to lay out the structure. The current stage is the mature stage, and it will last for about 4 to 5 billion years. That's the current estimate. The total life cycle of the sun is about 10 billion years, and our sun is believed to be about 4.6 billion years old. So in about 4 to 5 billion years from now, we will get past this stage into the future stages. It may sound incredible, but the Puranas have a description for each of the 5 stages of the sun, right? Each one of these stages, and I hope to share that with you during the course of this presentation. Yeah. So the first 2 stages are described through stories, right? An allegory. So the sun is it's not described as a textbook, but it's described through a story, and I'll give you an example, including the transition to the current stage, the mature stage. What is interesting is that the red giant stage and the white dwarf stage are outright descriptions. They are just as a textbook, school textbook would describe it. The first story is a very brief story, and the second story is a slightly more complex story. Obviously, the mature stage that we can observe now is quite detailed. What is really interesting is the red giant and the white dwarf stage are significantly detailed, right? So let's go to so first thing is, let me stop here. Is my speed okay? Are people able to follow me and everything is fine? Just want to make sure I'm hearing.
From my end, it is okay. I think everybody is getting properly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So let's go through the first 3 stages, right? So we'll talk about the birth, the young star, and the mature stage. And we will talk about the science first. So very briefly, yeah. So the most widely accepted hypothesis for the birth of a star is called the nebular hypothesis. It's the most widely accepted model of star formation. And according to this hypothesis, stars form in giant clouds of hydrogen. They are called giant molecular clouds, and they are named after the constellation that they are located in. So on the right, you can see this picture. It's a picture of the constellation Orion. And you can see these 3 stars here, which are the belt of Orion. And the cloud that you can see here is called the Orion molecular cloud because it is in the constellation Orion. And these molecular clouds can be anything from 10 to 100 light years in width. So they are really huge in size. And these giant molecular clouds can stay unchanged for long periods. So they can be without change. But some perturbations suddenly initiate star formation. So for example, it may be a supernova, which gives out a shock wave. It could be a giant passing star or something of that sort causes a small region in this giant cloud to start to collapse. And what it does, in one place, it forms a ball of gas. And this ball of gas, it collapses due to its own gravity. So the molecules in this ball of gas, they attract each other and they start getting closer and closer to each other, and they form a sphere of gas, right? At this stage, the star emits neither heat nor light, okay? Let's see what the Purana says about it. It's a very brief, just 2 verses, right? The Puranas, there is a story about the birth of Martanda, and this verse talks about the fetus leading to the formation of the sun. It says, in the beginning, the Holy Lord created an egg within her belly, and her belly is Aditi. So the sun, Martanda, is the son of sage Kasyapa and Aditi, right? And then the Purana says the powerful fetus was within the egg, right? And then it says, when it was taken out of the belly, it resembled a dead lump. Since he was born Mrita and as an egg Anda, the Savitra, the sun, is called Martanda by the learned men. So Brahmanda Purana, right? So the fetus, Martanda, was inert. It did not produce any heat or light. It was an egg-shaped. It was a circular-shaped thing like an Anda, as it is described here. And this is just as what the current science suggests. So very interesting correlation. Let's go to the second stage, right? The science of the second stage. So this giant ball of gas continues to collapse. And again, it collapses by its own gravity. And as the star continues to collapse by gravity, the pressure increases and it creates heat, and it starts to emit heat and then light, right? At this stage, it's called a young stellar object. It still has a disk of gas and dust around it. It's called the protoplanetary disk. And over a period of time, out of this disk, the planets are formed, in case any planets are formed, right? And over time, this young star becomes extremely active, right? So here is an image of a T Tauri star, which is a very young star. It is not yet a formal star, but it's called a T Tauri star. And so this group of young stars are called T Tauri stars. Yeah, and these stars are very bright and very active. They are characterized by giant flares up to 1,000 times larger than the solar flares we see on the sun. So our sun also has flares, but these flares are giant, right? And so if you can see in the picture here, you can see that it's a pair of T Tauri stars, north and south. And you can see how far these flares are going, right? You can see this huge flares of gas and X-rays that are emitted from the star. And so because these flares are so huge, the star does not look circular. It looks very of a different shape. It looks misshapen. And these are called T Tauri stars. And it's called a T Tauri star because the first star identified like this was found in the constellation Taurus, right? So they just named it T Tauri stars, basically. No more reason for that. And then you have the transition to the current sun, right? And so the star continues to collapse, right? It is again by gravitation. And what happens is that the temperature and the pressure in the core continues to increase. And over a period of time, fusion starts. When the pressure becomes very high in the core, nuclear fusion starts off. And the hydrogen atoms in the core, they fuse to form helium, and the fusion reaction produces energy. And what happens now is that the sun stops collapsing. The star stops collapsing. Because what happens is that the core starts to produce heat, and the heat of the core pushes the star outwards. It makes the star expand, whereas gravity causes the star to collapse. And so the two forces are in a balance, right? Because the two forces are in a balance, this entire ball of gas is very hot, and it's almost a perfect sphere, right? And with very little flaring. So you can see from the image on the right, it's a ball of gas in dynamic equilibrium. The heat of the core trying to make it bigger, and the gravity trying to make it smaller, right? So it's a very clear and a beautiful star shape. So the current sun is smaller, it is less bright, and it is more circular than the T Tauri star that we saw earlier. Okay. Now let's see what the Puranas say about it. There is a story in the Puranas called the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan. So you must, at least the names may be familiar to you. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read it. So the sun god Vivaswan marries Visvakarman's daughter Samjana. And Visvakarman is the creator of all the immobile beings. So the Purana says, originally the form of Vivaswan was so refulgent, and refulgent here means bright, that the rays spread sidewards, upwards, and downwards. And the gentle lady Samjana was afflicted by the form of the Lord of the firmament, i.e. the sun. And so basically what the story says is that when they were married, but the sun was so bright that Samjana could not even look at the sun. That was how bright he was, and he was too wild and so hot, so she could not stay close to him. So she felt very unhappy, right? So she went, that's what it says, Samjana was very afflicted by the Lord of the firmament. She went very unhappy that with her new husband, she's not able to spend time and to look at his face, right? So Samjana returns to her father's house. She leaves behind in her place Chaya, who's a copy of herself. And her father receives her warmly at home, but he says, you're now married and I cannot help you. I cannot interfere in your household affairs. So she doesn't know what to do, and she goes off to pray, right? And after a period of time, son finds out that Chaya is not his real wife. And so he goes around looking for her. So he goes to her father's house. He goes to Visvakarman's house, and Visvakarman says, she came here, but she has left home. And he suggests to the son that you reduce your brilliance slightly, and I can help you with that. Okay? So the son goes into meditation. He doesn't know where. This is the story. I'm telling you the story. He goes into meditation, and through meditation, he discovers that his wife Samjana is praying, and she's actually praying for him to be less bright so that she can live with him better, right? She's easier to live with, right? And so the sun turns to Vishwakarman and asks him for help. And he says, "Pare down my splendor now," quoth the sun also to Samdina's father, Vishwakarman, O Brahman. And Vishwakarman thereupon pared down the splendor of the year-revolving sun and obtained the praises of the gods. This is a quotation from the Markandeya Purana. Right? So Vishwakarman proceeds to reduce the brightness of the sun. And what he does, he places, this is what the Purana says, he places the sun on a wheel and prunes out the irregular, superfluous parts of his brilliance. And when the brilliance, refulgence was taken away, the sun had its brilliance uprooted or reduced. So all these the brackets and all, these are not mine. These are by the translator in the original text. I have not added anything. The only thing I've added is the underlining, right? So here you can see that Vishwakarman prunes, so he reduces the size of the sun. He removes the irregular, superfluous parts away. So the parts that are jutting out, which are the flares, he removes. And he reduces the brilliance. Here, brilliance is reduced. And in the process of pruning the sun on a wheel, the Markandeya Purana says, Vishwakarman kept intact in spherical shape the 16th part of the glory of Lord of Heaven. When 15th part of his glory had been pared away, the sun's body was exceedingly beautiful and charming then. So what a beautiful phrase, right? So he says that the sun's size came down to 1/16. So if you look at it in volume terms, the sun's size came down, the radius came down by about 60%, right? And then he says the sun's body was exceedingly beautiful and charming. So now it's perfectly circular and it's beautiful to look at, just like we saw in the previous image. So in the process, what has happened during the story is that the sun is reduced in size, the sun is reduced in brilliance, and the sun looks smooth and circular, spherical, right? And these are precisely the three changes which are suggested by modern science. So it's quite an amazing alignment between what the Puranas say and what modern science has to say. There's another passage. So first thing is, if I go to the previous passage, both the Markandeya Purana and the Brahmanda Purana have long description on this. I have just taken one or two verses, otherwise it would have been too long, but there's a lot more detail in both the Brahmanda Purana and the Markandeya Purana. Okay. In the Varaha Purana, in chapter 26, there is a small passage that describes this event. Right? The passage says, the Devas pray to the sun because he's very bright, right? And it says, "Be pleased at our prayer and protect us all, O God." When thus extolled by the Devas, the sun assumed a gentle form and shed luster on them. The fierceness became reduced for the Devas. It was on the Tithi Saptami that the sun became embodied, right? So it's on the Varaha Purana says it's on the Saptami that this reduction in size of the sun became real. And basically, the verse implies that the sun became gentle. It says his fears assumed a gentle form, so the fierceness was reduced. This fierceness was reduced. It also says that it's on the Tithi Saptami that the sun became embodied, was born, right? And in the Skanda Purana, there is a verse that says this is in the month of Magha, Jan, February, the Shukla Saptami. And in the south of India, it's called Radha Saptami. The Ratha is the Rath of the sun, and the Saptami is that Saptami. In the rest of India, in the north of India, it's called Surya Jayanti, the birthday of the sun. So it is amazing that in our culture, we actually celebrate the birthday of the sun, and we have an entire description of the birth of the sun that aligns with modern science. Okay? So it's it was quite amazing to me when I came across this. So there's a lot of other details about the sun in the Puranas. The Bhagavata Purana talks about the size of the orbit of the sun and the distance of the sun from the earth. It talks about the motion. All the Puranas talk about the motion of the sun around the earth. So there is nothing wrong in saying that the earth moves around the sun. because it's a question of frame of reference. If you are sitting on the earth, the only way you can say that the earth is moving around the sun is if you are in a place which is far away from the sun and the earth and stationary. Only then can you say that the earth is moving around the sun. If you're sitting on the earth, then your observation of the sun moving around the earth is absolutely perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. So all the Puranic descriptions about the sun moving around the earth are perfectly in line with modern physics. There is nothing wrong with it. The second thing the Puranas talk about is that the moon reflects the sun's light. So it was not accepted in modern science until Copernicus, which is in the middle of about 500 years ago, right? They used to think that the moon was, they used to worship the moon as a god in a temple, because the moon, they thought, had its own light and moved about in the heavens. And but the Puranas long before had already talked about the sun, about the moon growing in size because of the light of the Susumna ray of the sun. And then, very interestingly, the Puranas talk about the water cycle, right? So the water cycle was first, so you know the water cycle, right? The water cycle is because of the sun's heat, the water evaporates, it forms clouds, and then the clouds, there is precipitation and rain falls, and the rain falls, and then it drains into the oceans, and this is the very elementary form of the water cycle. So if you look at other texts about 2000 years ago, they just keep saying that that the rivers keep flowing into the ocean, but the oceans never overflow, but there is no talk of a cycle. The water cycle was first proposed by a French engineer called Bernard Palissy in the late 16th century. And it was not until early 19th century that modern science accepted the water cycle as something, as a phenomenon. Let's see what the Puranas say about the water cycle. So the Brahmanda Purana has this passage. With his rays, the sun takes up the water, the very splendor from all living beings. In combination with the wind, the rays of sun carry the waters from the ocean. That water then becomes the nectar life-giving life giver unto the plants. As soon as the season approaches at the proper time, the sun changes the saltish water into sweet water and gives the water to the clouds by means of his white and non-white rays. The water stationed in the clouds falls down when they are wafted by the wind, accompanied by the wind, they spread everywhere for the welfare of all beings. And it also talks about the dust. So it says there is a verse separately that says smoke is essential for the formation of clouds. So basically the dust particles in the smoke are essential for cloud formation. And we know today that condensation occurs to form a cloud around dust particles, right? And the cyclical nature of the process is also very clearly mentioned here. The water is continuously thrown up, turned into vapor, and dropped down, Brahmanda Purana, right? So again, about 2000 years ago, they had this whole water cycle mapped out as a cyclical process in nature, right? So again, very interesting insight. So after this, I'll come to the last two stages. Yeah. So we'll talk about the red giant stage and the white dwarf stage, and we'll start with the science. So in the red giant stage, the hydrogen in the core is exhausted in about 4 to 5 billion years, as I said. And it's useful to understand that this 4 to 5 billion years is very similar to the current end of Kalpa, which is 2.3 billion years. So it's not identical, but it is similar, right? So I'll leave it at that. I won't get into more detail. And the hydrogen in the core is exhausted and it gets converted into helium. So all the hydrogen becomes helium in the core. And so now the sun can produce energy in two ways. The sun in the core can fuse the helium to produce carbon. So helium has an atomic number of 2 and carbon has an atomic number of 4. So 2 helium atoms can produce carbon. And the hydrogen in the shell can join together to form helium. Right? So and both these things can release a lot of energy. And as a result of this, the sun grows enormously in size and it becomes what is called a red giant. So an example of the red giant in our nakshatra system is the star Rohini. The star Rohini is a red giant. And the word Rohinika in in Sanskrit means woman with a red face. So the name, the red is also already in the name Rohini. And if you look at the descriptions in the Puranas, Rohini is one of the daughters of Daksha. And he always talks, and the Puranas talk about Rohini as the chief among the daughters of Daksha. So it's a very bright star. In fact, it's the brightest star in the constellation. But when the sun grows in size, what happens is that Venus and Mercury get absorbed into the sun. So let me show you. Let's look at this. Can you see the cursor that I'm showing here? Is it visible? It's not visible.
Yes, visible. It is visible.
Okay, wonderful. So you can see the sun here. This is the sun as it is. You have Mercury here. You have Venus here, and you have Earth and Mars. And this is called the habitable zone. And this zone is where it is neither too hot or not too cold. Mercury and Venus are too hot, and Jupiter onwards is too cold. Here you see the sun has become much bigger, right? And Mercury and Venus have disappeared into the sun, right? And the Earth is no longer in the habitable zone. The Earth is very close, and you can see it's practically on fire. And then you have potentially Jupiter and Saturn in the habitable zone of the Earth, right? So I didn't create this. This is well understood today, and this is from a site called phys.org, and I thought it was a very good way to illustrate what is going on here, right? So, so there's a couple of things that happen, right? The first thing is that the sun keeps producing solar flares, and the sun loses mass due to flaring. So, every time the sun sends out solar flares, large amount of the mass of the sun gets thrown out into space, and as the mass of the sun gets thrown out into space, the mass decreases, and over 1 billion years, the gravity of the sun decreases. And as the gravity of the sun decreases, the Earth starts going further and further away from the sun, as do all the planets. But when the red giant sun grows in size, and the scientists have actually modeled this, right? The sun, even though the Earth is now further away, the sun becomes so large that it comes up right up against close to the sun. And so here is the image that you see on the right is an artist's impression of the Earth close to a red giant sun, right? So the red giant sun grows in size, and its surface comes close to the Earth, and the Earth is literally burnt by the sun's heat and the solar flares. So you can see the Earth is burnt black, and it's actually glowing in some places, right? It's just an artist who created a painting to demonstrate this. So let's see what the Puranas say about this, right? The Puranas have a specific term for a sun in this stage. Very difficult to believe this. The sun in this stage is called a Samvartaka Aditya, the sun that destroys the worlds, right? And so it's very clear. When the end of the Kalpa arrives, the sun of 7 rays assumes the form of Samvartaka Aditya, the sun of final annihilation, and burns down the 3 worlds. So according to the end of the Kalpa is about 2.3 billion years from now, and modern science says this will happen in 5 billion years. So there's a difference in timing, but you can see that it's reasonably close, right? And there is it's hard to believe, but there's a long passage in the Brahmanda Purana, almost 25 verses that describes this thing. It's not just one verse here or something. I'm just going to cite 2 or 3 verses. The Brahmanda Purana mentions this in 2 or 3 verses. The same thing is mentioned in virtually all the Puranas because it is the Pratisarga. The Pratisarga is one of the 5 components of any Purana, which is the destruction. And so every Purana has it, but the Brahmanda Purana has it in very good detail. So it's a very good text to take it from. Then it says, so the sun is not completely up to the very close to the sun. It's just growing bigger and getting near the sun, near the Earth now. It says, then a continued drought lasting for 100 years takes place. So for 100 years, and it's not clear whether it's 100 years, human years or divine years, right, takes place. On account of it, only those living beings deficient in strength or having very little potentiality on the surface of the Earth become dissolved and get mingled with the dust. So they basically die and they become ash, right? So basically they can't survive anymore. Let's see what else it says. Then it says that the sun grows even bigger The water in the rivers and oceans are turned into vapor and the moisture is sucked out. It says the 7 rays of the sun that blazes in the sky, sucking up water, drink water from the great ocean. Being burned by that brilliant flames, the earth, including mountains, rivers, and ocean, become bereft of moisture and vicinity. So the entire oceans become dry, completely dry. Rivers become dry. So there's absolutely no water left on the earth, right? The mountains collapse because of the sun's heat, because it's so hot. The mountains literally explode because of volcanic pressures and so on. And the Purana says everything mobile and immobile becomes dissolved, and the earth, devoid of trees and even grass, may seem like the back of a tortoise. So the back of a tortoise is smooth, right? There is nothing on it. It does not even have depressions, right? It's just a very, very smooth thing. And so it says it becomes very, very smooth because all the mountains have collapsed into what were then the oceans, and everything becomes almost a circle. And finally, the earth literally glows from the heat of the sun, as shown in this image from earlier. And it says, getting the fiery splendor transmitted to it, the entire universe slowly assumes the form of a huge block of iron and shines thus. It means, so when you take a block of iron and put it in a fire and let it heat up, it starts to glow. And the Purana actually describes this. It says the fiery splendor transmitted to it, the earth literally shines because of this heat. So it's quite amazing how detailed the description is. So the next stage of the star from a scientific perspective is the white dwarf stage, and it's the collapse of the star. And the core continues to undergo fusion. So we saw that the hydrogen is 4, and it becomes oxygen and so on and so forth. Then the atoms become so large that they are no longer capable of fusion, even at very high temperatures. And what happens is when the fusion stops, there is no more energy. The star of the sun cannot produce any energy anymore. And so we saw early on that it is the heat in the core that prevents the whole sun from collapsing, right? So the heat is pushing the sun outwards, and gravity is making the sun collapse. And when this heat is gone, when the energy production is gone, the sun quickly collapses to become a white dwarf, right? And it's very small and very dense. And what happens is that the core collapses. The core collapses because it doesn't produce any heat, but the material in the shell is thrown out, and it produces these beautiful planetary nebulae. And many of you that are interested in astronomy see pictures like this, because what happens is that the gas that is thrown out, it starts to glow with the radiation that is generated by the core, and it starts to glow. So these are often they are real images, not because of some external fake colors are being added to them. So very beautiful images. And this is the last stage of the star. So it's the death of the star. So the white dwarf star is incredibly compact, right? It's half the sun's mass because the matter in the shell gets thrown away. And it's the size of the earth. It may be hard to believe. And because it's collapsed, it's very far away. So when the sun was a red giant, the surface of the sun was very close to the earth. When the whole sun collapses, it's very, very far away from the earth. And it's not producing any heat. So this is actually a picture of a white dwarf star against a Jupiter-sized planet. So generally, the sun is 1,000 times larger than Jupiter, 1,000 times. And now you can see this white dwarf star is smaller than Jupiter, much smaller than Jupiter, the size of the Earth, right? And so what happens is that it's no longer producing any heat, it's far away, and the water vapor that was in the Earth's atmosphere. So remember all the water vapor, all the oceans got boiled up and went up into the atmosphere. It starts to cool, and it forms huge clouds, right? So I want to give you an idea of what huge clouds means, right? So it means, firstly, it's the water in the oceans, the water in the rivers, the water in the polar ice caps, the water in mountaintop ice caps, the water in bodies of plants and animals. So when a human dies, about 80% of my body is water, right? The water from the bodies of plants and animals, of insects, birds, and even water from the underground aquifers, they boil up and they get into the atmosphere. So this entire water is in the form of a vapor, and it's in the atmosphere. And when the sun stops heating, stops producing energy, it starts to condense and form huge clouds. And the Puranas describe it. The Puranas describe it as the clouds of dissolution. So all the water vapor in the atmosphere starts to condense, forming the huge Samvartaka clouds. And it says some of the clouds are the size of an excellent city. Some can be compared to herds of elephants. Some clouds shine like huge mountains. Some clouds appear like extensive flat ground. And the cloud showered torrential rain. Then these clouds showered rain in huge torrents. They destroy the whole of the extremely terrific and inauspicious fire. So remember, the earth is on fire, and the lava that is inside the earth is actually coming out. So literally it's on fire. The rocks are melting and hot and so on. So the first thing that the earth does is that it puts out all the fires, right? And then what happens is that there is so much water that the entire universe gets filled with it, right? So you have to imagine that there are no longer ocean basins, right? Because the earth is now completely smooth because of all the heating, and the entire water that was on the surface of the earth has gone into the atmosphere and is now falling down as clouds, as rain. And so the entire earth becomes flooded with water, and the whole of the earth gets submerged in Ekarnava, the one great ocean. So the word Arnava means ocean, right? And Eka Arnava is one ocean. And it says in the vast expanse of ground, including mountains, continents, and intervening spaces, being as if swallowed up, stands submerged in water. So everything is covered in water, right? And this submergence of the earth marks the end of a kalpa. So it says, when everything mobile and immobile becomes dissolved and destroyed in that single terrible vast expanse of water, when 1,000 Chaturayugas are completed, it is said that the kalpa has come to a close. So this marks the end of a kalpa, right? So you can see that it talks very clearly about the death of the sun as a star. Oops, sorry, about the end of a kalpa. Yeah, and I'll quickly go to a summary and a close. Yeah. So we started with the Puranas and the life cycle of the sun, right? And we saw, as per science, we saw that the star has 5 stages. We saw the birth, the young star, the mature star, red giant, and white dwarf. And when you look at the Puranas, we say the Purana talks about the story of the birth of Martanda, for the birth of the star. It states that it's an inert star that emits neither heat nor light. It says marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan for the young star and its transition to a mature star. The brightness of Vivaswan, rays extending in all directions, misshapen. It talks about a mature star, with the rays in size and the brightness reduced, the Surya Jayanti and the water cycle description. It talks about the sun as a Samvartaka Aditya, as a red giant star. The sun heats up the earth, making it glow. And it talks about the collapsed white dwarf, and the sun collapses, the planet cools, and the Samvartaka clouds that bring torrential rain and submerge the earth. Right? So everything is amazingly described in the Puranas. Right? It looks very close. So you can see there is an astonishing level of correlation between the science and the Puranas in terms of the life cycle of the sun. Everything is very clearly it's very clearly shown. Right? The first 2 are through stories, and the mature sun, the red giant, and the white dwarf is through actual descriptions. It actually describes it in surprising detail. And the book that I've written is called From the Beginning of Time. And the sun is one of the 5 parts of the Puranic universe, right? So the book explores the Puranic universe in 5 parts. The sun, and I just described a lot of what is written in the book about the sun. But there is also, most of us don't realize that there is a story of the great flood in the Puranas. Right? And we generally think of the Great Flood as coming from the story of the Bible and the Noah's Ark. But there is not one but 2 descriptions of the Great Flood, one in the Kalika Purana and one in the Bhagavata Purana. Right? So, and that, interestingly, is also part of the story of the sun, but I'm not going to get into that now. There is a description of the earth, the shape of the earth, the size of the earth, the geography of the earth, and the events in the past of the earth, such as the descent of Ganga. So most of people in science realize, most of us don't think about where the water on the planet came from, right, on the surface of the earth. Now, we know it comes from rivers and oceans and so on, but where did it originally come from? So the scientific community has agreed now that practically all the water on the surface of the earth has come from extraterrestrial sources. It has come from outer space, right? And the descent of the Ganga describes this thing in amazing detail. You have to just read it very carefully. You have to understand the science, like you have to understand the science of the sun. But if you understand the science and you read the Puranas in some detail, you can find the amazing amount of detail about the descent of Ganga. And Ganga actually came down from the heavens. So the rivers on the planet actually came down from the heavens. It's not just a story, it's real. It talks about the Bhumandala, the planets, the Dvipa and the Sagara. So we are on Jambu Dvipa, we are surrounded by the Lavana Sagara, and all the way to the Pushkara Dvipa. It talks about the Loka, so the Devaloka and the Patala Loka, right? It describes that. And finally, it has a story of the moon. And the moon, the origin of the moon is not something that is understood even today by science. It's an area of investigation. People have some hypotheses about what the moon could have originated from. It is surprising the amount of detail that you can find in the Puranas about the origin of the moon. And few of us realize that it had an origin, it disappeared, and it reappeared in the churning of the Kshiroda Sagara. So when the Kshiroda Sagara was churned, one of the divine beings that came out, in fact, one of the first divine beings that came out of the churning of the Kshiroda Sagara was the moon. So a very beautiful description of that. It draws upon 3 or 4 different Puranas, to tell the story. It also talks about the units of distance and time. It talks about the Yojana, the Kalpa, and it talks about time dilation. So many of you may have heard of the story of King Kakudmi and his daughter Revati going to visit Brahma, right? And the story of time dilation. And the book ends with a homage to Maharishi Vyasa, right? His story of his birth and all his contributions to knowledge today, to what we consider knowledge today. And I want to end with the title, right? So the title of the book is called The Beginning from the Beginning of Time. And from the standpoint of the Puranas, it is inside the Kalpa that everything is known, right? Between the Kalpas, there is very little that is known, right? So you have the night of the Brahma, then you have the Kalpa. And so you have, and so we are right now in the Varaha Kalpa. And so for this creation in the Varaha Kalpa begins at the beginning of the Varaha Kalpa. So the book attempts to look at about 10 different events which are described in the Puranas from the beginning of the Varaha Kalpa. And obviously they are very old, but it goes to examine the geological record. So what does geology say about these old events? And again, there's a surprising amount of information that we can find and surprising amount of correlation as well. So that's one level of from the beginning of time. But what is even more amazing is the Puranas talk about the origin of the universe, what they call the origin of the universe. And some of the verses that they have there is something, again, that modern science is beginning to realize today. So that title actually works in 2 levels, both from the beginning of the current Kalpa and from the beginning of the universe itself. With that, I'll go to my own personal journey. I never planned to write a book. I was just interested. I was not even interested in it's just thing. I had a conversation with a friend, and he was saying he's going to read a book about the Great Flood, which is the Egyptian story of the Great Flood, right? So it's the story of, it's called a book called the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I said, okay, I'll read the Indian version. And I thought it was the Matsya Purana, right? So I had no idea. I had never read it before. I had no idea what to expect. It's a very thick book, and I thought it probably stories of gods and goddesses and so on and so forth. But it was a text of such great sophistication that I was completely engrossed, right? Then I went to read the Shiva Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, and then I couldn't find print editions, so I downloaded the other Puranas of the internet and I printed them. So I had the read the Brahmanda, Kalika Devi Purana, and parts of the other Puranas. And then as you read more and more of the Puranas, I started realizing that it's very similar to space science. It's very, so initially when you see something, you say, oh, it's just a coincidence, just maybe just a choice of words becoming one like the other. And then you realize when you read more and more and more, and then it more and more becomes apparent, and say, okay, you cannot have coincidence at this level. You can have coincidence of one verse, two, you cannot have coincidence of whole passages. So I started working on this book about 2 years ago, close to 2 years ago. And I've researched about 22 different translations of the Puranas in the journey to write this book. And my only request, if I have a request at the end of this presentation, is that the Puranas are a treasure, right? And they should, when we explore this treasure through cultural ways, through religious ways, through spiritual ways, like the Bhagavata Purana is a great document on bhakti, on the bhakti tradition of philosophy, right? This group, IR Bharat, also looks at the Puranas for history, right? Because there are king lists there and they can help us establish history. But my request is that the treasures of the Purana should also be explored using science, because it looks like there's an enormous amount of science that is embedded in the Puranas. Okay. With that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And once again, sincere apologies. I think there was a loose connection in the PC, because of which the battery wasn't getting charged and it ran down. But with that, I'll stop my presentation, and I think it's about 55 minutes now, and I'm happy to take any questions, any Q&As, yes, or any comments as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question.
Thank you, Ganeshji. It's really very wonderful talk and some very unique information. And so, as you suggested in your concluding remark that these our Purans are treasures, and we should explore more and more and more. And so, this is really very big contribution of in this particular science, I say, that you have come out with, not only for the Indian, those who are reading these Puranas, but maybe some scientists of Western philosophy. They will also learn these things, because you are the bridge between that science and Vedic information. So that is something wonderful. So I now open this forum for the questions and answer, if there are anyone, or I will go for
comments.
some. I will. Or we are ready to take some comments. So may I now request our Groverji is today there, and I came to know that you are also alumni of some IIT. I don't know exactly. You please introduce yourself in brief, and please make your comments in this beautiful talk.
Thank you. I am IIT Kanpur graduate of 1971. Okay. Did MTech in 73.
Wonderful.
Went to IIT Bombay for PhD thereafter, but didn't finish it.
Okay.
I have a special interest in writing on such topics in Hindi.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I would like to translate your book into Hindi. Not only I will convert it into small, short stories for children.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Wonderful. I'm so happy to hear it. So happy to hear it.
So I was just writing a mail to you. That's nice. I'm 24 now.
Okay.
And publish a newsletter, Udyog Sanchetana, which is free.
Wonderful.
Which is to create interest about industry among engineering students.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Groverji, and I will also go through your Udyog Chetna. I am very much interested in this kind of subject because I teach engineering students. So this will be good if I share some of information like this.
Three IITians. Siddharth is also from IIT
Siddharth is also an IITian.
So I am very much blessed. In my left and right, both the corners, we have some very senior and alumni of IIT, and in this beautiful platform. So I am very much thankful to IR platform that. given
Thakkar
me
ji is
chance.
there.
Yeah.
Dr. Thakkar ji is there.
Yeah, yeah.
Dr. Thakkar ji is from, I think, space science.
All right. Wonderful.
Basically I am botanist.
Yeah.
Basically I am botanist, but I have served ISRO for 37 years.
Great.
I want to translate your book in Gujarati. I am writing a book on history of Lohana community, and it starts from sun only.
Wonderful, wonderful.
God's
wonderful.
son,
Lord's son.
Ikshvaku once.
Great.
So this book will be useful in my writing the book also and understanding many things.
Wonderful, sir. Very, very happy to hear that.
From
It is
Indore, our young colleague, Vivek Garg ji is there.
Hi, Vivek.
Are you able to get my voice?
Yes, yes,
Sir,
yes.
I
Yes.
joined just 15 days before. I have joined another course as a Acharya, Master in Siddhant Jyotish. And I started from the Surya Siddhant in Ujjain. And I want to say that I also want to like to contribute something in your whatever the things you have said right now. I'm very grateful that Ganesh Swaminathan ji is here. I will also like to contribute some, and I will help to the Viren Grover ji to input some of my knowledge while writing in Hindi.
By all means, by all means, by all means. And I just want to add that I look at this as the beginning, right? I don't think that we know everything about this. The Puranas are like an ocean. It's like an ocean, and we have a lot to find out. And so the more that young people and other people can come together and put their minds together to uncover the beauty and the glory of the Puranas, the better off all of us will be. You know, it's that would be wonderful.
Any comment from Adaraniya Vedveer Arya ji is there?
Vedviji is little busy. I just talked to him a couple of minutes back. So he is listening it, but he is also involved in some work.
Okay.
I have one point,
Can you speak
one more
some?
point.
Yeah, Thakkar ji.
See, there is a description in Vishnu Purana about Antriksh Nagar.
Huh.
Okay.
Cities in the space. But
Right.
I think those cities might not be in space, but these cave cities in mountains, that must be Antriksh Nagar in height.
Possible, I don't. So one thing. So let me make one comment here. So even though I've quoted from Brahmanda Purana or Varaha Purana or Markandeya Purana, I make sure before I come to conclusion that it is not just one Purana that talks about it. So it has to be mentioned in 2 or 3 different Puranas, at least similarly. They won't be the exact same words, but the same idea has to be present in at least 2 or 3 different Puranas. Then we will know, because these are very difficult to believe. Even for me, you may not believe. I didn't start to write a book. I thought to myself when I read this, I said, this is not possible. So then I thought, maybe 5 years later, if I told myself that I read something like this, I may not believe myself, forget about anybody else. So I started making notes. And I started making more and more notes. I said, okay, I have to write a book now. There is no option but to write a book. So these are not easy things to believe. So my suggestion is that we try and make sure that there is as much evidence as we can have. Instead of just going with one verse, try and look at as much evidence as we can have, so that we feel very comfortable defending it in case somebody comes to us and says, no, I don't believe you're true. And then we look at the science and say, what does the science say? So we have 2 or 3 Puranas, then we have the science, and then we look at the whole thing together and say, yeah, this is a very likely possibility that this is what they are talking about. Right?
One more professor, Dr. Rajendra Gupta ji. Rajendra Gupta ji hearing? He is botany professor.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Rajendra ji.
जी नमस्कार.
Namaskar ji.
I heard Ganesh ji with very great interest. It was a wonderful talk. Now, the only thing is that many times we believe that our ancestors knew probably everything. So sometimes I feel that we have to be a little skeptic.
Very, very true. Very true. Yeah, we have to challenge. Actually, there is a verse in Brahmanda Purana. I didn't show it here. It's there in the book. It's there in the end of the book. It actually says you should use evidence, the pramana, inference, logic, and the scriptures as a starting point. You should use it as a starting point. You should test it, which means you have to be skeptical, just like you said. You should be skeptical before accepting it as truth. So,
Absolutely.
so for a Purana to say that about the Purana is a very wonderful thing. You know, when I read it, I couldn't believe it. Generally, every religion tells you, don't question us. We are the right religion, right? Here is a Purana that telling you to question it and say, don't take what I am saying at face value. Make sure you challenge it. Make sure you test it before you accept it. I feel wonderful when I read things like this about our texts. Really, very well said. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
Yeah, because what's happening is that with resurgence of Hindutva, now there is a tendency that our ancestors knew everything. We had all knowledge. I think sometimes I feel very uncomfortable about it.
Correct. And maybe it is true, maybe it's not true, but we have to validate everything first. First, validate everything. Yeah.
Because there is a tendency, I hear so many lectures nowadays, they say that everything which is written in Vedas is Brahma Vakya. They were, Swatah Praman. You don't need any evidence for what is written in Ved and Puran. That kind of a thing.
Yes.
Very so the Ganesh's lecture has come as a fresh air.
Thank you very much.
So he's tried to analyze things on the basis of what is known in science and tried to correlate.
Correct.
So, I mean, rather than this tendency which is resurging now that everything which we have in our ancient heritage is to be taken, as the last word.
Right.
I think we have to look at it in the way of documents for history of science.
Correct.
If we can, I mean, there is no doubt our ancestors were far ahead of the Westerners and other parts of the world in terms of the knowledge which they generated in their times.
Very well said. Yeah.
But if the tendency is to say that they knew everything and they were ahead of the scientists in our times, that's going a bit far.
True.
So that's what I liked about Ganesh's talk, was that it was very balanced, and he resisted that sort of a tendency which we find in many of the speakers with science background, but who are speaking about the Purans and Veds and all that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
No, sir, but my suggestion is that before understanding Puranas and Vedas, we must study our Central Asia also, countries, Nuristan, Paristan, Kapistan, Sikyang, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Samarkand, Bukhara. We should know about these places also and our trade route also, silk trade route also.
True.
Very right.
Thank you, sir. We will continue this kind of discussion later also. But due to the time constraint, I would like to take this whole discussion towards a conclusion. And before going to that, may I request Surenji to please extend a vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks. We are already thankful, so much thankful to Ganeshji, but a formal vote of thanks to our speaker and our participants.
धन्यवाद सिद्धार्थ जी। आज विजयादशमी और अमेरिका का चुनाव, इन दो कारणों से हमारे बीच में उपस्थिति कम रही, लेकिन बहुत बड़े विद्वान और वरिष्ठ लोग और युवा लोग भी, आदर्श कुमार सिंह जी एकदम युवा 30 के नीचे वाले हैं, विजय प्रसाद उपाध्याय जी भी मुझे लगता है यंग हैं, विवेक गर्ग जी अभी इतिहास पर नया काम कर रहे हैं, और राजेंद्र गुप्ता जी रामायण के भूगोल पर, जियोग्राफी इन रामायण और उसके जो अदर्स एस्पेक्ट्स को सामने लाने का डॉक्टर राजेंद्र गुप्ता जी भी काम कर रहे हैं। वीरेंद्र ग्रोवर जी आपके मुझे पोस्ट रिटायरमेंट के बाद रिटायर्ड बट नॉट टायर्ड बहुत अच्छे काम में लगे हैं सभी। ठक्कर जी हैं सब। तो गणेश जी, आदरणीय गणेश जी IIT IIM से पढ़े हुए हैं। बहुत इसको मल्टीनेशनल कंपनी में अपनी सेवाएं देने के बावजूद अपनी भारतीय संस्कृति और सभ्यता से पूरी तरह जुड़े हुए और अब उसमें योगदान देने के लिए उस भारतीय संस्कृति सभ्यता को उसको प्रचारित करने में, उसमें अपना योगदान देने के लिए अब कटिबद्ध हैं। हम उनके आभारी हैं। उनकी पुस्तक का फोटो यहाँ पर हमने लगाया था, फ्रॉम द बिगिनिंग ऑफ टाइम। अगर आप में से अनेक लोग की पुस्तक कहाँ मिल रही है, वो अगर वो अपने ग्रुप में शेयर करेंगे तो बाकी लोग भी उस पुस्तक को खरीद कर पढ़ना चाहेंगे। मैं बहुत बहुत आपका आभारी हूँ गणेश स्वामीनाथन जी। आप जब भी भारत आए हम आपसे मिलना चाहेंगे। आप इस समय सिंगापुर रहते हैं और ये आपका पहला कदम इस पुस्तक को हम मान रहे हैं। ऐसे अनेक कदम आपके, ऐसे अनेक कदमों का हम सबको इंतजार है। आप भारतीय संस्कृति और भारतीय ज्ञान विज्ञान के और विषयों को लोगों के सामने लाएंगे, ऐसा मुझे पूर्ण विश्वास है। सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। नमस्ते।
Thank you, Surenji. Thank you very much for this wonderful vote of thanks. And I will close this session. Just one of my remarks. I can take this advantage as a host. So, I mean, a couple of years back, when I was a student in IIT Kharagpur, I met one saint, and his remark was that you IITians are useless. You have so much good brain talent, and you go for making money. That's all. But now I'll say that no, all the ideas are not useless. Okay, so thank you very much, Ganeshi. And with this, I will also introduce you in some couple of more organizations, those who are really work in this, very focused in this kind of work. So that I will discuss with you later. And I am very much thankful to every single participant in this event. And my personal thanks to Ganeshi, because he has continuously guided me to organize this webinar very smoothly, and I got all his help. And he was very much tolerant also, because I was very much busy, not giving response in time most of the time, but it's okay. So I also apologize if any mistake from my side. So, and I am very much thankful, very much blessed to have all these senior people. I'm learning, and with all of you, we will keep meeting and we will keep discussing all this information. We are in our IR group. I think we can discuss later also. Thank you very much. Now I'll stop this meeting. Namaste and happy Vijayadashmi to everyone.
Happy Vijayadashmi to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy Vijayadashmi.
Happy.